Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntac Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I have the pleasure of facilitating today's event. This webinar focuses on DoD-funded research efforts to increase energy resilience through microgrids. First, Dr. Jeff Marquesi from the National Renewable Energy Lab will talk about quantifying the reliability of different distributed energy resources and expected performance. Second, Mr. John Halliwell from the Electrical Power Research Institute will talk about the results of a study focusing on a holistic approach to the electrification of non-tactical vehicles used on DoD bases. Each of the two presentations will be followed by a brief Q&A session, and depending on how we're doing with time, we may conclude the webinar with a longer Q&A session. The next two slides provide instructions on optimizing your webinar experience. If you have not done so already, please download Zoom at the link shown here and provide it to you in your registration confirmation email. If you have difficulty downloading Zoom, you can view the slides using a compatible internet browser such as Firefox, IE, or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you continue having difficulties with seeing the slides, or if your screen freezes, try keying in Control and F5 to perform a hard refresh of your browser. Keep in mind that you can download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage and call into the conference line in your webinar registration confirmation email. Another option to view today's proceedings is to go to the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here, as we will be streaming live. Just a few reminders about how to ask questions. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You can submit questions in writing by using the Q&A box on your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to get your questions in. We do encourage you to submit them well in advance of the Q&A sessions. When you submit your questions, we ask that you add your organization name at the end of your question so that we can identify you. Please do not submit questions in the chat box, as it is reserved for comments related to technical difficulties. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Timothy Tetreault, who is the ESTCP Program Manager for Installation Energy and Water. Before joining SERDP and ESTCP, Tim worked at the National Renewable Energy Lab, where he focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy project development for the federal sector. Tim, please get us started.
All right, thank you, Rula, and welcome everybody to today's SERDP ESTCP webinar. I'm going to give a quick overview of the programs and then hand it back to Rula to introduce our speakers. So SERDP and ESTCP are the Department of Defense's investments in environmental installation, energy science, and technology. And the programs report to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Resilience and Optimization, headquartered at the Pentagon. The SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established by Congress as a partnership between DoD, Department of Energy, and EPA. And SERDP addresses high priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on the top priority DoD requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate and validate innovative environmental installation energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. Advances in science and technology provide the DoD with the tools needed to effectively manage and restore the assets to protect troops, their families, the public, and the environment. SERDP and ESTCP investments improve installation energy resilience, environmental cleanup, UXO remediation, resource conservation, and the sustainment and maintenance of defense assets. SERDP and ESTCP fund, monitor, and actively guide relevant and applied research, development, testing, and evaluation projects for the department's top environmental and installation energy challenges. Our current programs currently fund over 600 active projects. To maximize research impact, SERDP and ESTCP collaborate with top talent across the sectors. In 2023, we funded projects with 77 academic institutions, 91 federal performers, and 52 industry partners. Our innovation and technology development inform DoD policy and ultimately improve environmental and energy management. Our webinar series highlights outstanding projects across all our main focus areas, and the next webinar for the Installation Energy and Water program is on December 12th on analyzing building operations data for improved performance and energy savings. And registration is open for webinars through the rest of the year. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link here, and all past webinars are archived and can be accessed using the link shown here. I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage, and we would appreciate if you can take a few moments at the end of the presentation to complete a survey that will pop up on your screen. And now I'd like to hand it back to Rula to introduce our speakers and take it over.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Marquesi. Jeff doesn't really need an introduction, but here goes anyway. He is an emeritus at the National Renewable Energy Lab and an independent consultant on energy technologies and resiliency. He previously served as a senior research advisor at NREL, where he provided strategic guidance for NREL's national security work, advised DoD's energy technology programs, and conducted research on energy resilience, microgrids, and energy storage. And before joining NERL, he served as a chief scientist at Nobless, a nonprofit science, technology, and strategy organization. Jeff has over 20 years of government leadership in research, technology development, and policy aimed at making the DoD a more sustainable and effective organization. At DoD, he served as the executive director of SERDP and ESTCP. And before joining DoD, he worked at the Institute for Defense Analysis, Stanford University, the University of California, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In terms of educational background, Jeff received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Cornell and a doctoral degree in physical chemistry from MIT. Jeff, please get started.
Rula, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a little time to talk about some work funded by ESTCP and jointly the Department of Energy on the role of distributed energy resources reliability and energy resilience and stuff. You know, the obvious fact is that if your generators or your batteries or whatever DERs are not operating, they cannot provide the power needed to create energy resilience. This is true whether you have a building tied system or a complex microgrid. Luckily, there is quite a large data set, empirical data available on DER reliability. And NREL, with the sponsorship of ESTCP, did a statistical analysis of these that allowed us to really understand quantitatively what the impacts of DER reliability are. And then based on that, we developed a new version of a tool that many of you may be familiar with called REopt. I'll talk about it later, which can account for DER reliability quantitatively. Let me spend a second going through some of the basic things we'll be talking about in the definitions. First, about reliability. We're going to use a concept called survival probability to quantify the reliability of a backup power system. And it's quite straightforward. It's just the probability that the critical load at any time will be fully and continually supported during a power outage of the grid. Obviously, it's time dependent and condition dependent on the assets there. And then when we talk about reliability, we also sometimes talk about it for individual generation assets, DERs. And what we mean is the inherent ability of that generation asset to produce power when called upon. Now, it assumes that the fuel is available. Obviously, if you have a generator that is perfectly functional but is empty of diesel fuel, it's not going to produce power. Similarly, if your natural gas pipeline is interrupted. In the case of solar energy, photovoltaics, if the sun is down, or in the case of a battery, if the battery state of charge is too low. Now, backup power systems can be as simple as 1 or 2 generators tied to the individual building to support its critical load, or more commonly, as the interest of this series of talks, configured in a network as a microgrid. And we're really interested is, will the system, whether it's a building tied or a complex microgrid, meet all the critical loads for the duration that you required, independent of when that outage started? You know, whether it started in the first hour of January 1 or the last hour of December 31st. This is going to be a function of the DER reliabilities, which unfortunately have generally been ignored in previous analysis, the design of the microgrid, things about the critical load profile, time of the outage, and fuel availability. So let me spend a second now and dive one level deeper and talk about the sort of standard metrics used to quantify reliability. And there are 2 critical ones, which I'm going to focus on. The first one is called the mean time to failure. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It just says that when a component or generator, a PV is running, how long does it run on average until it fails? This could be quantified from empirical data by just a ratio of the total runtime divided by the number of failures while running. So it gives you a sense of, you know, if it's very long, then it's very unlikely that they will fail. If it's very short, the system will fail quite quickly during an outage. The second metric you need to understand is what's called the availability, or sometimes the operational availability. And that is simply, will the DER be available when an outage starts if I call upon it? And so it might be undergoing maintenance or repair because of, and been taken apart. And so the question of how long it will run is really irrelevant because it may not be available at all. So those are the 2 main parameters I'm going to talk about when we talk about the reliability of distributed energy resources. And how do those parameters reflect back to the question of resilience, which we quantify by survival probability? It's quite simple if you're looking at an individual generator, let's say, tied to a single building. So the survival probability is just equal to the availability probability, which is usually in the high 90s percentages, and then it decays exponentially with time, with a time constant equal to the mean time to failure. So that you can see by that if we don't have high availability, because the system's often down for maintenance or repairs, the survival probability is inherently low. If we have a very long mean time to failure, then that will not decrease over time, but a very short mean time to failure, it'll decay with exponential probability quite quickly. Now, if you look and think about what does this mean for military installations, let's talk about the traditional older systems, which were building-tied generators. If we're going to have multiple buildings with critical loads, we require each of those loads to be supported. Those critical loads, even if spread across dozens of buildings, are all required to conduct the military mission on the installation. And so the failure of any one of those generators will lead to a failure of survival of the critical load required for complete mission support. A microsystem is a little different because it's a network system, and really, but it's just quantitatively what we'll be looking at is what's the probability at any hour during the day, during the year, will the generators or other assets produce enough power to satisfy the critical load. So let's spend a second now and talk about the type of distributed energy resources that we're concerned with and which are commonly used on DoD installations. And then talk about, how do we and where do we get this data to be able to quantify the reliability of these assets. Now, emergency generators are extremely common. We're talking about packaged diesel generators, which is what is used on DoD installations. We have over 11,000 unit years of data. So the reliability is well quantified empirically if you do a proper statistical analysis. When you look at prime generators, which are used natural gas systems, whether they're reciprocating engines or turbines, the data set is much more limited. It's 50 to a couple of hundred unit years. But we also have semi-quantitative data from industrial surveys, which tell us a lot about the reliability. Solar systems, photovoltaics, again, we have almost 40,000 unit years. Wind turbines is a very rich data set, over 100,000 unit years. And what drives that is that availability, reliability of wind turbines is a key factor in their economic viability. And so this is something that industry has always been interested in. We're going to focus solely on land-based wind turbines. The data for sea-based is much more limited and less certain. The final DER, which is being used much more often around DoD, are lithium-ion batteries. These are relatively new technology, big stationary lithium ions. We have limited empirical data, but we have to make some assumptions about what that reliability will be. And we've done that. And hopefully over the next 10 years, we'll have significantly more data. So the plot I'm showing you here is sort of the bottom line whole story about individual distributed energy resources survival probabilities. So this isn't talking about how they're connected to each other or how one might design a microgrid. It's just the individual components. And what's plotted here is a survival probability versus an outage duration from 1 hour out to 2 weeks. So the red line at the bottom is the emergency generator. Now this comes as a surprise to people who don't work in the field often. Emergency generators are extremely reliable if you're worried about a few hours. Their availability is quite high and they rarely fail within the first few hours. But if you try to run an emergency generator for 2 weeks, on average, under 75% of them will survive that thing. Now, people often don't see this themselves because rarely do they run their generators during testing for anything more than 30 to 60 minutes. But this is based on very large data sets. And this is also assuming the generators are well maintained. I think most people who work in this field know that unfortunately, many times generators are ignored and not well maintained. If the maintenance procedures are not up to the UFC code or industry standards, the reliability drastically drops. If you then look at sort of natural gas prime generators, gas turbine, reciprocating engines of the size used on DoD, they have a high reliability, but again, after 2 weeks, it's in the 80%. The final line on this is the solar PVs. Now remember, this is the reliability assuming fuel is available. Fuel in this case means the sun is up. Now this is not a plot of that you get continuous power over 2 weeks. It basically says that if the PV is not out of commission because you may be replacing inverters or other hardware, the likelihood that if it starts at the beginning of an outage that it will stop working is pretty much nil. They are extremely reliable, and they are essentially solid state systems, and you can count on them. But they have the intermittency issue, which we'll come back to in a second, which is due to the change in solar power from clouds in the diurnal cycle. Slide 24. So let me say, let's look at the classic system which DoD relied on, for 50 plus years until the last, 5 years really, prior to developing microgrids. So this is the impact of emergency generator reliability on a system of building tied backup power stations. So there are two cases represented here. Let's say an installation which has 10 buildings, the red line, which have critical loads, or a large installation which has 50 buildings. Now, 10 and 50 buildings with critical loads is not a large number for DoD, but I've just used those as an example. And the statistics for these generators are listed below, and these are the average statistics you find from empirical data. And what you see is that, although a single generator might have a 75% chance to continue running out to 2 weeks, once you have multiple independent ones, those probabilities cascade. And so if you had a 50 building system, within 2 days, the probability that you have all your critical load supported is close to 0. And with even a small base with only 10 buildings with critical loads, you can see it drops quite a bit. The black curve shows you what fraction of the buildings are without power. So some of the buildings always will have power, but over 25% don't. This, you need to remember though, is you can't know ahead of time which of the buildings will be failing. This is a fundamental problem with emergency generators. Historically, they were used for very short duration. They're designed and well designed to support backup power for 4, 8, 12 hours. They were never intended to be used individually as standalone assets for multiple days to multiple weeks. And so they cannot provide the type of reliability and energy resilience that DoD requires. One way to get around this is simply to have an N+1 system. That is, you could have a backup to the backup at a building. If you do that building by building, you'd still end up with a very poorly managed system with poor performance. The other way to do it is with a microgrid. And in the references, we have analyzed multiple diesel generator microgrids, as well as microgrids, PV, and batteries combined with generators. And because microgrids are network systems and inherently have what's called an N+1 reliability, so let's say you had, 10 megawatts of peak critical load on your base spread across a dozen buildings, you would build a microgrid with more than 10 megawatts of power, and you would have one extra one. Not only does it have one extra one, but they can share their power. And given that the load changes from building to building, you end up with a system which is highly reliable. So this problem of reliability is drastic when you look at single building tied systems, but can be engineered around when you build microgrids of different design, as long as you take it into account. Slide 25. So just to summarize the impact of DER reliability quickly, no backup power system will ever achieve 100% survival probability. I mean, one can do models that claim that, but that's just not reality. And ignoring the individual reliability of DERs in your modeling and your design of a microgrid or any backup power is going to give you poor performance and lead to poor design choices. As I said before, emergency generators are the least reliable DERs for outages more than 24 hours. And even backup-to-backup systems have their limitation. Fundamentally, spinning generation, whether it's natural gas turbines or diesel generators, are constrained by their inherent reliability and obviously the fuel availability. While renewable energy systems, like solar systems, are constrained by their intermittency, but have extremely high reliability. And one of the key takeaways from many of the papers that have been written in reports at NREL, which a reference to show later, is that you have to take reliability and intermittency into account to have a quantitative estimate of your microgrid or any backup power system's performance. And what we've seen many times is hybrid systems, which combine generators with solar, with batteries, have a much higher survival probability and are much more robust to the inherent reliability of any of these systems. Slide 26. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have a new REopt capability, which allows people to do this. I'm going to go through rather quickly some slides, which just sort of illustrate screenshots. I don't plan to go through them in detail. But what we've done with the support of ESTCP and the Department of Energy is created a new module in REopt, and I'll talk a little bit more about REopt, which allows you to factor in real reliability. It does an economic optimization first using traditional REopt methods, then has a new module called the Energy Resilience Performance Tool and allows you to iterate. I'm going to go through this with some drawings next, so if that's not quite clear, hopefully it will become shortly. Slide 27. For those of you who aren't familiar with NREL's REopt system, it's a computer-generated computer system which allows you to model energy systems to determine cost-effective optimized systems under many different constraints or goals. And it's used routinely to guide investments and do initial design choices at sort of a 20% design level. It allows you to look at almost any DER or other type of energy system you can imagine that's commercially available today. Slide 28. So what does REopt actually do? So it's a mixed integer linear program. There are many other things like REopt on the market, which are all fundamentally similar. In the blue are the inputs, which drive, what type of DERs you're considering. What are their performance characteristics? What are their costs? Then you also have to be inputting things such as the economic drivers, such as the tariff structure or market opportunities. And then you have other things which are your goals. Obviously, economics is always a goal to limit your costs, but do you want to have a resilient system? And what does that mean for you? How many days you need to be able to survive a power outage? You also have to enter the loads, both electric and thermal, if you want to model both, and that will then design a system for you. So this is the traditional REopt system. Chart 29 shows in a simple flow diagram how we've taken that and added reliability into it. So we have the existing REopt optimization system, which operates, if you're familiar with REopt or other tools such as DareCam, Zindi, or Homer, they all have similar functionality. It will design for your constraints that you put on it in terms of what resiliency you need, and what type of DERs you want to consider, what's the cost optimal system, assuming that the DERs are 100% reliable. And that's how all these tools work today. The new thing we've built is the Energy Resilience Performance Tool, ERP, which then is fed from REopt, or can be fed externally by other tools, if you wish, and then factors in the reliability of each of the components of the system. And from that, it can output what the reliability across every hour of outage start time of your design system. Now you can run this directly from the output that REopt came, but as I'll go through in a second or two, you can modify what the REopt optimization shows if you find that the performance of your microgrid isn't what you had hoped it to be, and you could tune it then by iteration. And once you've changed that, you can then run it back through REopt to get an optimized system and an economically accurate forecast. So what I'd like to do is just go through a couple of quickly charts that show you sort of qualitatively how the tool looks and works. So chart 30. So like REopt's tool has always been, you have to first choose your goals, and then you have to select your technologies. So we're talking about when you have you want to look at cost savings with resilience. Now, the new difference is we have separated out the emergency generators, which have specific type of reliability, from prime generators, which might be reciprocating engines or turbines themselves. But it's very similar to the existing tool. Slide 31. You have to, of course, then define your loads, and then you have to define what fraction of those loads are critical loads, and then you have to define what outages you want to have the constraints subject to. The new version of REopt allows you to do up to 4 different outage start times for a given duration at once. And if there are questions, we can talk about the impact of that constraint after this discussion. Slide 32. So REopt is run, it outputs the standard REopt output, it tells you the optimized system. This is a case where it's a mixture of solar PV, lithium-ion batteries, and generators. It tells you the economics, and it's been built to meet your resilience goal of surviving a certain number of hours for those different start times. Slide 33. This can then get passed to the ERP tool, and you could run it just with the click of a button for the system that REopt is optimized. And it will output a survival probability curve for that system, which is a network system in this case, a microgrid system, and you will get the curve, and other statistics are available, which says, this is how well it'll perform. Now, I think for most people, this would not be good enough. So you might immediately say, well, I only had 1 generator of that size. Maybe I should combine it with a second generator, which backs up the first generator. But if you go to slide 34, this is an example in which you have changed the number of generators that was output from REopt. You haven't changed the size in this case, but I've chosen to do 2 instead of 1. And now you have an extremely resilient, reliable system, which will survive any outage of this duration, no matter when it starts in the year. But now you've changed your system, and as shown in chart 35, you can now automatically feed those inputs into REopt as a constraint and calculate the new optimal dispatch as well as the total life cycle cost. So on slide 36, just want to conclude, DER reliability is one of those facts that get ignored far too often, but it must be accounted for in assessing energy resilience performance if we're really concerned about supporting critical loads. Building tied emergency generators cannot meet DoD energy resilience objectives, even though they've been used for decades and decades to do that. There's a total disconnect between their performance, even if well maintained, and the requirement for 2 weeks of energy resilience. You can make we have quantitative estimates for reliability of DERs. They don't require modeling. They're just based on empirical data. And as I've shown you in the charts, there's a new version of REopt, which is publicly available, to help design or analyze proposed microgrid solutions. And hopefully on 37, these will provide benefits to DoD to provide more accurate system level resilience, allow a fair comparison of generator-based systems versus renewable energy systems with hybrids. If you don't include realistic reliability, you falsely believe your generator-based systems have 100% reliability or survival probability. And therefore, a system built on intermittent generation from a PV, which is sensitive to the solar irradiance, will seem to be less, have a lesser performance. But in fact, it's just not true. If you want to handle them in a fair and equal way, you have to include both the reliability of the components and their intermittency. This tool is freely available and it can be used as part of REopt or as a standalone post-processing. Slide 28, I'll just flip through it. You have copies of it, how you can access the tool, and then the next chart just shows a number of peer-reviewed publications that are available. And I appreciate your time. And chart 40, we'll have time for Q&A, hopefully. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Yes, we do have time for Q&A. And as a reminder to the audience, please submit the questions that you may have by using the Q&A box on your screen. The first question, Jeff, is from Modula S. Can you please share available references for survival probability and reliability studies?
Sure. The chart that we skipped through, number 39, I don't know if you can go back, has a number of references there. So, yeah. So there are two reports which were done by NREL in combination with the Army Corps of Engineers PREP, Power Resiliency, I forget what PREP stands for, I apologize. And they are publicly and freely available. One is on the NREL website, one is on the SERDP ESTCP website. Those were detailed statistical analysis of existing empirical reliability data, which was quite robust. And so if you want the specifics on those, they're available there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And just a reminder, you can download the slides and access this list of references and resources by going to the webinar webpage for this webinar, and the slides are already posted. Great. So the next question is from the University of Michigan. Is there any work being done to allow for consideration of diverse potential climate realities from downscale GCMs in the ERP model?
So there is a lot of work going on in the community. Obviously, as you know, I'm sure, downscaled climate modeling, and SERDP has funded a lot of work on those application of those to the considerations of military installations. The ERP tool only considers the reliability of the generation assets. The climate change that we will be seeing, seeing already and will be seeing in the future will affect the results in a couple ways. One, it'll affect your load profile because of heating and cooling loads, and those are something which are input to REopt, so it's a user provide thing. In addition, they affect most strongly extreme weather events, which will drive the frequency and duration of outages. Now, we're calculating, can you survive an outage of a day, a week, 2 weeks, and whether it starts any specific time in the year. How valuable that is to you will change as climate change increases and extreme weather event. I will point out there's a lot of work done at Lawrence Berkeley Lab on this issue, that we know empirically that what are called major event days by utilities, which are when the power outages go out from a non-predictable reason, i.e. something outside of sort of normal repair, extreme events, hurricanes, flooding, fire, etc. That frequency has been increasing over the last decade very significantly. And statistically, it's correlated with the extreme weather change driven by climate change. But there isn't anything in the ERP tool which factors that in, but the inputs that you put in and the value you put on the resiliency you need is certainly dependent on climate change and the regional or downscale models will certainly help you figure that out.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. This next question is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Construction Energy Lab. Will REopt incorporate new technologies such as hydrogen storage?
Yes, that's a good question. So there's a host of new technologies which are becoming quite important. Hydrogen storage is one of them. Another class I would argue is the long duration energy storage. Right now it has lithium ions, but it doesn't have built into it a variety of emerging technologies for long duration energy storage, which range from flow batteries to iron batteries and stuff. Work is being done currently at the lab. And so the lab has the ability to model it, but the tool or the software is really still at a research stage, and so is not part of the web-based or API or open source thing. It will be at some point, I think sooner than later, given the interest I know right now. We're hearing from Department of Energy and Department of Defense. So those will be added soon, but they can be modeled now if you work directly with folks at NREL.
Great, thank you. This next question is from an anonymous attendee. Can you discuss REopt's portfolio analysis function? Does it optimize for a network microgrid, for example, centralized solution, or does it treat each load and building individually?
So it's a good question. Let me sort of separate it out because I think most people won't recognize it. In REopt, you can do a single load or you can do a portfolio of loads. When we do microgrid analysis using REopt, we consider that as a single load. So it's the load of the campus or the critical load at that campus. Even though it may be many buildings, it is still a single load. So the portfolio analysis is not used for typically microgrid analysis. If you're trying to do a more broad scale assessment of what your options is, given a portfolio of locations, that's what the portfolio analysis is. And that the ERP tool was really focused on a single location, even if it may have multiple buildings. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. And one last question before we transition to our second presentation, and we'll get back to additional questions towards the end. This is a question from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Construction Engineering Lab. If the installation that is going to be analyzed has a battery energy storage system, how can we input that into the tool?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So it is part of the tool. What we know about lithium-ion batteries, and we expect to be, as lead-acid batteries, we expect it to be similar for some of these other batteries, are that they are, they're inherently solid-state devices, so they have high reliability. The biggest factor we're worried about is not that the battery will stop working during the outage, but it might not be available at the start of the outage. So that was what I called operational availability. And that may be because, they're replacing some component, and it's out of service. I mean, they're not in service, every hour of the year. We have put in a default value, but it's very easily editable. There's a pull-down menu, you can change it. We believe that the availability of batteries is probably between 96 and 99% of the time. You get claims from most companies that sell integrated lithium-ion stationary batteries, and you'll see them ranging mostly 98% and above. We don't have big enough empirical databases to really justify one decision. So we put a mid-level default value of 98, but I think the simple way to assess it is you could just change it parametrically and say, well, what if the battery doesn't work as reliably as we thought? Or what if it's doing quite a bit better? This is different than PV systems, which particularly utility scale PV systems, i.e. things that are bigger than a megawatt, which is the most common type on DoD installations. We have massive amounts of data and they have very high reliabilities and stuff. I mean, it turns out we have huge data sets on that because for those scaled systems, for their tax rebates, they're required to report operational time to the Treasury Department, and NREL analyzes that data for the Treasury Department. And as long as we only report aggregate numbers, this is private data, they have let us use it for other purposes and stuff. But we don't, to date, have similar data for batteries, unfortunately. So you're going to just have to make a parametric estimate. I think it's going to be quite high, particularly if you're using a major manufacturer, which is UL certified and stuff. I mean, they're very interested in those high reliabilities. But again, if you want to be safe, you can just vary the number quite easily in REopt. I hope that helps.
That does. Thank you so much, Jeff. And please stand by for additional questions that we can get to towards the end. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and transition to our next presenter, who's Mr. John Halliwell. John is a senior technical executive and team member in the electric transportation group at EPRI in Knoxville, Tennessee. His main area of focus is infrastructure development for plug-in electric vehicles. He joined EPRI in 2007 and has been active in the electric transportation space since 2008. He currently serves as the co-chair of the SAE Hybrid EV Committee, former chair of the SAE J1772 Electric Vehicle Conductive Charge Coupler Task Force, and former co-chair of the SAE AE-7D Aircraft Energy Storage and Charging Committee. John most recently has been developing compliance and testing processes for electric vehicle charging systems. He has broad experience in designing and application of electronic circuits and electronic systems in instrumentation controls, embedded systems, and power supplies. In terms of educational background, John holds bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Tennessee. John, welcome and please proceed.
Thank you, Rula. Appreciate that. For slide 43, please. We'll go over the presentation outline. We're going to discuss our approach. I'll give you an overview of what we're talking about with non-tactical vehicles, what we would like to know, so the fact finding that we're doing, what data we found typically available. We want to look at how we're going to assess electrification of that equipment, and we'll talk about conclusions and the benefits to DoD. Slide 44. Our approach was really to first select a sample base where we could work with them to see what kind of data was available. And really what we need to know for the non-tactical vehicle fleet is, what do you have? What types of equipment, what types of vehicles? And we take NTV to be pretty broad. It can be a sedan, it could be a pickup truck, it could be a crane, it could be a backhoe, it could be, a front loader, the various types of equipment that might be electrified over time on a DoD facility. We want to collect fueling data. How are those devices being fueled now? Central location, multiple locations, that sort of data. And then ultimately, we need to know the operational data from that equipment. How frequently is it used? Where is it used? How long is it used? We worked with a sample base. We partnered with the Naval Weapons Station, Seal Beach, and we've worked with their fleet manager and some other folks there on the base, looking at the data that they have available. We've also had a past ESTCP project where we worked with the Air Force Research Lab and a couple of Air Force bases that we're drawing on from that experience as well in moving forward. Slide 45. When you look over NTV, we've kind of found that in looking at these bases, there's really two broad categories. There's the on-road non-tactical vehicles, and there's the non-road non-tactical vehicles. On-road would be your sedans, pickup trucks, flatbed trucks, those sorts of things. Non-road would be that equipment that may have wheels, but it's probably used to move equipment. It might be tugs, forklifts, dirt moving equipment, those sorts of things. And so when you look at those two broad categories, we'll touch on each of those three areas I talked about. So the inventory, the fueling, and operation. Slide 46, please. And so what we'd like to know is how many you have, how you fuel them, and where they're located, when, where, how long. And ultimately, we're going to take that data and translate that into an energy use and then ultimately power, where the electric grid is sized based on power. It's easier to get to energy. That's sort of the total work done by the vehicles as they're used. It's a little more difficult on power because we have to know more details about that operational cycle. Slide 47. So as we look across those categories, the green stars is where we found detailed records. So the base has a Government Services Administration fleet. Those vehicles, we had detailed data on the vehicle type, the year of purchase, model year, all that sort of data was available. The military also operated Government Services Administration fleet vehicles. And again, there we found detailed records on vehicle type and operation, or vehicle type and the sort of statistics around that piece of equipment. On the non-road side, the base, our sample base maintained an asset list. And that asset list contained a lot of the equipment that would be sort of described as that non-road category. And the base had a detailed list across, the equipment they have, hundreds of items. It's not as clear if military units maintain equipment that's not on those lists. So we're still working with the base on this non-road side, and actually have a meeting scheduled for next week. Our experience with the Air Force bases is that there are some things that are maintained at the unit level that may not, make their way onto these sort of detailed inventory lists. So it's something to keep in mind as you work through this approach to sort of looking at a holistic energy use. Slide 47. I'm sorry, yeah, there we go. On the fueling side, so the GSA fleet, again, they're detailed records. The GSA fleet, when those vehicles are fueled, RFID cards are used to identify the vehicle, and the drivers manually enter odometer readings as they do the fueling. So there are detailed records on a monthly basis about, how many times that vehicle total fueling for the month, and a tally of the mileage for that vehicle. That holds true for the military vehicles as well. They're also tracked with that sort of detail. On the non-road side, we find that at least at our sample base, there were very, very little detail about the actual fueling of those. They're more dispersed. They may be located in more locations. Fueling can be done for these smaller devices. It may be where a central fueling location is used to fuel tanks that are carried to a remote location. That's a little more complex in terms of that tracking, and we didn't find that detail there. Slide 49. So when we talk about operations and locational data, here we can kind of lump both the non-road and on-road devices together because they really found a similar situation. Parking locations and storage, generally the fleet manager is pretty familiar with the general areas where vehicles are located. A key function for the fleet manager is to make sure that these vehicles are getting their routine maintenance. And so he's monitoring, how many miles they've been, have they had oil changes, and those sorts of things. As far as operations, where they are and how far they're driving, how long they're working, that information is not gathered at the central level. There's not a database of how often a vehicle is driven. There's not a database of how often a forklift is put into use. That information really isn't needed at the base level to maintain their mission. When you think about how you operate a fleet on a base, if you're keeping the vehicles running, they're meeting your needs. There's really not a great need for that. And it's something very different. EPRI has worked with commercial fleets, and oftentimes commercial fleets that are electrifying, certainly the early ones, they tend to be fleets that are very focused on where their bottom line is tied to how their vehicles operate, and that's just not the case on a military base. So having central database of operational data, it's just not there. But we know that the operators have this information. They know how often they drive their truck or operate their forklift. So the information is out there, but it's very dispersed. It may, literally be hundreds of individuals that have the knowledge about the equipment that's operating on a base. Slide 50. So ultimately, we want to take this data to calculate at first energy. And there's methods to do that. We can look at the fuel use records. There we can take the chemical energy of the fuel being used and then develop a translation to the grid electric impact that fuel use would have. And again, we're taking a holistic approach. So we're thinking across a fairly large amount of the fleet. We're not thinking about a piecemeal deployment, but if you were to electrify all of the NTV on a base, sort of laying out what does that entail. We can certainly look at the data we have to get vehicle type. You can look at the engine sizing, environmental factors like temperature, terrain, and you can go through a study that way to sort of pin down how much energy a vehicle is using. The ultimate goal here, again, is what is the total energy that the electric grid will have to provide, and that we'd have to know that for some time interval, whether it's a week or a month or a year, but we're looking for that totalized energy, which ultimately can lead us to power. Slide 51, I'm sorry. When we look at the power needs, if you think about energy is the sort of accumulated work, whereas power is very, very closely related to how fast you're working. So how often does a vehicle get driven? How far is it driven in a single day? So it's much more about the timing of that operation. And the electric grid is sized based on power. So the electric grid can deliver some amount of energy, but when we size transformers, when we size wires, when we look at the switchgear and the equipment that's going to serve electric loads, that is all sized based on power. Ultimately, if you want to get to power and energy, you need to make either some assumptions or find records that give you the timing of those non-tactical vehicle operations. How long are they used? How long do they sit idle? Where do they park? And I mention that because there is a geographic component. Generally, liquid fueling is done at one or two sites on a base or maybe at an off-base location. Generally, you don't have multiple locations where you do liquid fueling just from the cost and infrastructure that has to be there. Unlike that, electric fueling can be done very localized. You can put chargers in parking lots. You could put them in garages or behind buildings. They could be near flight lines, near docks, wherever there's space and electric power available. And so it's much less concentrated. It's more distributed. But what that means is we now need to know what vehicles are parking in those locations, because we're going to track how much power they need and how much charging is available localized at that site. And also, where vehicles operate may be where they're idle. They may park near where they operate, but it may be that the vehicle parks at a different location when it's idle and then it works in another area. We need to have some handle on that, start thinking about sort of sizing and locating charging equipment. The other thing, and I'll emphasize that with our next slide, but we'll stay here just a sec. The fuel use is not uniform across these non-tactical vehicles. You'll find some that are very heavy fuel users and some that are light fuel users. On slide 52, I've taken off the units here, but just to kind of give you a flavor of the height of the columns would be how much fuel was consumed in a month. And then across the bottom, I have 10 sample vehicles, I think, or let's see, 1, 2, 3, 10 sample vehicles. And each bar represents the different colors or different months of the year. So you can see a few vehicles where they only had a single fueling event, vehicles D and E. A couple vehicles had maybe 3 or 4. It's possible that some of these vehicles are new to the fleet, and so they only have data from the tail end. But we've also seen a few vehicles that we know have had very dispersed charge or fueling over the course of time. Then you can see a few vehicles are on the right side, vehicle G and H. They have very high fuel use. They're fueled every month. But even there, you can see there's a lot of variability. Like if you took the average, that some days or some months, there's much more fueling than other months. So the key point there is if you try to size your charging based on averages, you have to be very careful because the vehicle D will have very different charging needs than vehicle H, which is quite obvious here when you look at the detailed data. Slide 53. So we're working on our final report now. We're looking at 3 methods to go through sort of this ballpark estimation of the power needs of the on-road non-tactical vehicles. Again, we're revisiting the non-road next week with our base, really trying to dig into that a little more. But so here we're focused on on-road for the slides that I'll work through here. The methods we're developing, we know they're not perfect, but what we're really looking to do is get a bounding on how much charging is needed, where would it be located, and what kind of grid impacts would that have at a high level. And certainly as time passes and more precise data is available, we can review and refine these methods. Slide 54. So we've looked at 3 different methods. The first one I'll talk about here is, our first method. Here you assume a charge time duration. So in this case, I think we chose 10 hours. So let's assume that all those vehicles have to be charged in a 10-hour time window. We know how much total energy they need from our fuel use data. And so we can start making some assumptions about, what sort of power levels might we use. And in this case, we chose 3 discrete power levels to apply to the chargers. And then you start looking at how many days are available for charging, because we kind of have a total number of hours in the year, but there's holidays, there's weekends. You have to know a little bit about the base's operational cycle. Ultimately, that gets us down to a daily total time available for charging at those power levels. That's slide 55. And closing out on method 1, and we can size our charger population to try and limit to that time window. So here we're allowing the charger count to vary to meet the energy needs. And then ultimately we want to localize those and calculate total power needed at the geographic sites. Slide 56. Second approach we're taking is to assume a number of chargers. We know how many vehicles are on the base, and we know that DoD generally has some rules of thumb about how many chargers per vehicle they're going to supply. And so we could take those numbers, and again, taking that totalized energy, still using the same discrete charging levels, and now we're trying to look at how those fit with the vehicles in terms of being able to do a single charge that helps them meet their need for operation. Slide 57. So here again, we're going to calculate the number of annual charges by power level, and we again work through how many days are available, so we can sort of tie together daily timing and the number, and then from that we can calculate the needed charging power and power levels across the chargers. Slide 58. The last method we're looking at is we do have some monthly fuel use data. It's a little bit more, I would say, discrete in terms of showing the variations in vehicles. So we wanted to take a look at that as well as a method to calculate the charging needs. Here we have energy calculated from the fuel use by month. When we look at that, it's distributed across vehicles. We're trying to group that in sort of low, medium, and high fuel use groupings. And then across those groupings, we're going to use that monthly fuel use to calculate daily energy needs and ultimately figure out the charging times and energy needed at those sites given different power levels. Slide 59. So this method, we can identify basically the different charging levels and the daily needs, and we can sort of spread that across different power levels. So one option is a base has low, medium, high power, and DC fast charging available. We'll also look at if you had sort of a fixed level of AC charging, how well that fits with the fleet. And again, we're going to identify the daily needed charging across the different NTV, and then assign those geographic locations to look at the local power impacts for those vehicles being electrified. Slide number 60. So we know there are data gaps, and there's certainly ways that we can look to fill those. Some of this would be real-time data collection. Sometimes it would be, more of a passive type of operation. So one option, there are these readers that can be installed on the diagnostic ports that are available on board vehicles. It's onboard diagnostics 2 ports on light-duty vehicles. J1939 is often used on heavy-duty vehicles. These are modules that can be located in a vehicle, left in place for weeks to months to calculate or to capture the operational data. Another option is to look at the telematics data where that's available. I think GSA does have some capabilities on telematics. It wasn't clear, at least for our sample base, that they weren't getting that detailed data, but certainly some of the newer vehicles have this data capability on board. Operator interviews. When you're looking at some of the very specific pieces of equipment, this was vital to our work we did with the Air Force on flight lines, talking to the operators of the equipment, finding out how they were using a particular piece of equipment, the frequency, how long it was parked, and how many shifts a day that was used. Another potential option is satellite data. There's quite a few now commercial satellite services And those could be used to locate particularly the idle locations of NTV. If you had them take photographs at a time when you know the base is idle, you can use that to sort of find the concentrations of the non-tactical vehicles. You can also get the actual the height data from the objects in the images, so you can start to look at whether something was a sedan, a larger truck, or say a cab over. Those heights are available in some of the satellite data. That may be cost prohibitive. So the photos are not inexpensive, and so these methods would have to be looked at, in terms of budgeting across the base. The slide 61. So to conclude here, we think about the data that's available. It's limited. It's not needed to meet the general mission of the base, so that the data that is collected, helps the base accomplish what it needs. But having really detailed data about how many hours something is used a day is just not available. Certainly, we found that on-road vehicles are the easiest, because there are some data sources, particularly with the GSA side, where we can gather that data. Estimating the power demands, we need to know the pace and operations locations to make assumptions about where that power will show up on the grid. We have historic data from the base, but again, as we mentioned, there's the potential to augment that with simple studies. If you're going to electrify a particular group of vehicles, maybe look at the operation across those vehicles for a period of time through operator interviews or other means of data collection. And lastly, why do this? Well, if you don't take a holistic look, at the end of the day, someone may get the short stick on the electric grid. If you electrify a large portion of your fleet and you don't think about the needs and having a timeline for that, you can find that you'll use up your grid resources before you've accomplished electrifying all the vehicles and devices on your facility. Lastly, on slide 62, where do we see benefits for DoD? Certainly taking a holistic look at the non-tactical vehicle fleet on a base. What we're trying to do is provide guidance on the information gathering side. So what kind of data can you find? Where would you find that data on a base? And ultimately use that to help assess at a very high level the sort of electrical impacts you have if you electrify your full fleet. So I'll pause there. The contact information is there on slide 63, and I'll turn it back to Rula for the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, John. We've received a number of questions. The first one is from an anonymous attendee. How are personally owned electric vehicles considered when looking at installation-wide solutions?
So at this point, at least for our Naval Weapons Station Seal Beach, we're looking at their fleet. It certainly has the very high numbers of vehicles, and they are all fueled on the base. We know that. This particular base did not have a fueling facility on base that vehicles coming onto the base would use for liquid fuel. It's certainly an area that needs to be looked at. If there's housing on a base, or if employees are bringing electric vehicles onto the base, is there an intention to provide charging for those? It's not necessarily needed. Workplace charging can augment when someone owns an electric vehicle. So it's an area we're not looking at in detail, but it certainly is one that would need to be looked at, and very specific to bases, again, whether they have housing on site and whether base employees are used to being able to fuel on the base would probably play into that. Great question.
Great, thank you so much. This next question has to do with where does the data for fueling and vehicles reside?
So in the case of Naval Weapons Station Seal Beach, they gather their data through the GSA system. So they have a fueling site on base that actually telemeters data back to a central database. And for them, it's logging into a GSA website and downloading this data. But it does require some effort on the fleet manager's part to go out and gather this data. I don't think it was something that was automated. That was something they had to go and say, okay, I want to gather these fuel records. Now that was true for the base-owned vehicles. For the military vehicles on the base, there was also a GSA database, but it was managed and operated and owned by a different party on the base. And so one of the things we're seeing is that the responsibility, those different categories of vehicle types may vary on a base as to who's responsible for the fleet that the base itself operates and maybe each military unit. So the data is not in one central place, but the GSA data was readily accessible in similar format, but in different databases.
Great, thank you. This next question is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Construction Engineering Research Lab. What is the time step required to effectively analyze NPV, EV, CF impact to the power grid? Is it in minutes, 15 minutes, hourly increments, or more?
It's a tough one to pin down because that's very, very much tied to the operational data. Ultimately, on the grid, sizing is, really looking for your high power days. So it's not, the granularity of the data. Utilities typically collect 15-minute data. I think for a study like this, we don't necessarily need that high a resolution of data. We do need to get some measure of sort of hourly load, and mainly they're looking for what are the peak loads, because it's that peak load that we'll have to size the equipment for. I think if you were collecting data from vehicles, probably 15-minute interval is sufficient to capture most of that. I think the real world situation is you're probably going to feel pretty blessed if you can find even hourly data or daily data, just given the granularity of what we've seen. Most of the data was tallied at the month level from these larger databases. And if you want to go beyond that, if you're going to actually implement data logging, then probably that 15-minute is a great place to be in terms of capturing accurate data. The time frame you need to collect that data might vary as well. You need to collect data from a vehicle over a long enough time window to see how it might operate in different situations. Does the base have a really high pace operation period for a few days and maybe a slower pace of operation period of time? You'd want to log data across those windows to make sure you don't miss some peak of operation.
Great, thank you. This next question has to do with the kind of chargers that a base would be using. What kind of chargers are we talking about here?
So typically for the light duty vehicles, these are going to be located at the edges of parking lots. They're generally either pedestal mounted, they can be mounted to walls. There are AC chargers that deliver AC power to the vehicles. Those are typically done at either 240 volts or 208 volt AC. They can span the range of roughly 2 to 3 kilowatts of charging capacity up to just shy of 20 kilowatts. That will serve quite a few of the vehicles. And as we're looking at Naval Weapons Station, Steel Beach, there are a number of their vehicles that would be serviced by those AC chargers and would be able to meet their driving cycles. There's also the availability of DC fast charging, where power levels can go above from the roughly 25 kilowatt level on up to 2 to 300 kilowatts, depending on the vehicle's capability. I would imagine in most situations, a base is going to need some DC fast charging hardware, particularly to meet those times when maybe you have a high pace of operations or a vehicle is used in back-to-back shifts where maybe there's not the idle time to charge that vehicle. So it very much depends on how the vehicles are operated. So you're typically looking at that 3 to 20 kilowatts with AC charging capability, up to 350 kilowatts if you have DC fast chargers.
Thank you so much. This next question is as follows. Why do the charge locations need to be known?
So when you think about an electric grid, it is very localized. So the location of a substation, some bases have a single substation on site. That substation may be off the perimeter of the base. You may find bases that have multiple substations or multiple points where power comes onto the base. So if you think about it, it's almost like the circulatory system in a body that, it branches out to all these localized locations. And at each end of one of those branches, there is some known capacity. It may be, a few hundred kilowatts of capability at one location, whereas you could handle megawatts at another site on a base. And that's generally been sized based on the operation of those buildings and facilities on that base. So now you're augmenting, you're adding in additional load at those locations. So knowing where your vehicles park, that's probably where you're going to want to charge them. The ideal situation for an electrified non-tactical vehicle would be one where it can charge overnight or when it's idle, and then it's available for operation for a full cycle, for a full shift, however that equipment's used. Having that localized information is very important from the electric grid side, knowing where you're going to concentrate power use, because you may have to upgrade transformers or locate wiring at those sites. The other thing it tells you is you may have places on your base where you have parking available and excess power. And maybe by changing your operations a little, you could relocate vehicles to those places and find that you can electrify more vehicles at a lower cost because you're not having to change the electric grid. So it's very important, again, that localized power consumption matters.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And then one final question before we pull Jeff back in. Can telematics be used on the entire fleet?
It could be used if all the vehicles have that capability and that data is collected. And certainly what we've seen at this particular base, their fleet varied over an age of maybe 10 to 15 years. There were a few older pieces of equipment, particularly the non-road category of non-tactical vehicles. So telematics would generally support like light duty vehicles, sedans and pickups. It's probably available on heavy duty, but there may be a cost. Like it's not free to gather this data. That data requires a backhaul, like a method of collecting the data. Generally, that's through a paid accounts or services that are collecting the data and then putting that into a database. And then again, the non-road equipment generally doesn't have those types of facilities. So telematics is usable, and certainly with newer vehicles. But ideally, you're probably going to be replacing your older non-tactical vehicles first, electrifying those before you do your most recent change-outs because just the life cycle of the vehicles. But yeah, good question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And Jeff, if you can come back on, and we'll start with you. Both you and John spoke broadly about microgrid implementation and considerations for improved energy resilience. What can power up a microgrid for resilience, Jeff?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that, please?
What can power up a microgrid for resilience?
I think you have a lot of options, multiple spinning generations, diesel generators, natural gas systems. I think including batteries and solar systems makes a lot of sense and is both cost effective today and will be actually extremely affordable within the next few years. I hope that answers it.
That's great. And John, is there something you'd like to add?
Only that that there's also the potential for using vehicles as stationary storage, using them to pass power back to the grid. It's complicated because again, you need to know your drive cycles and you need to know whether the vehicle would be available to provide power to the grid and that resilience function, or if it needs to be on the road at that time. So there may be some potential for vehicles to be one of those resources, but certainly requires some study.
Thank you. And John, we'll start with you for this one. How temporary should a microgrid be, in your opinion?
Repeat that again, please.
How temporary should a microgrid be?
Temporary. I'm not sure I understand that question. Maybe I'll pass that one to Joe.
Yeah, so, excuse me. I mean, we have to separate out microgrids, which we use in theater, which are usually called tactical microgrids, versus those for fixed installations, versus those that might be set up as a natural disaster response or humanitarian response. I think for fixed installations, which is the focus here, the idea of a temporary microgrid doesn't make a lot of sense. I think most of the time, the economics say you should design them for 20 plus years. That doesn't mean they're fixed in their design. I mean, the energy world will change, markets will change, new technologies will come on board. But the fundamental networking and control systems need to be established with an assumption that it's for the next few decades and such. Obviously, in the tactical world, things are on the move and it's qualitatively different. And there, the assets are uniquely military, whether they're tactical vehicles, tactical generators, or the future tactical renewable energy generation and things like that. And so those are qualitatively different. But it's like any infrastructure investment in the energy space. It'll be for multiple decades.
Thank you so much. And before we wrap up, do you have any final takeaways that you would like to leave our audience with, Jeff?
Yeah, I think we're at a period where the department is very aggressively pushing forward with the deployment of microgrids. I think that's fully justified, and it represents, in fact, the fruition of decades of SERDP and ESTCP investments, which were started in this area before, MILCON money and large investments. The big issue, I think, facing people in making decisions on deploying microgrids, there obviously are very number of site-specific design issues that have to be tackled. But really, the bigger issues that need to be tackled up front, which are more uncertain, are the acquisition issues. How much of this is going to be done through appropriated funds or MILCON? How much is going to be done through third party? We're seeing some microgrids being built 100% through third party financing and such like that, while others are being built 100% under MILCON funding. I think the future will probably see a hybrid acquisition process, at least I hope so. But I think that, microgrids have turned the corner from being an experimental thing. It doesn't mean there aren't continued advancements which need demonstrations, but deployment's going to happen rapidly over the next several years and will help the department dramatically.
Thank you, Jeff. This is a really important takeaway. John, would you like to add anything before we wrap up?
Sure. I think on the vehicle side, I kind of feel like we're early in this game, and I definitely want to emphasize that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon when you start looking at electrifying the non-tactical fleet on a base. And keeping in mind, just because something is non-tactical does not mean it is not non-critical, right? These may be functionally very important to the mission of a base. And so things like Jeff talked about, the capability to back up equipment, that becomes even more important because now your mobility may be tied to the grid as well. So I think there are quite a few considerations there. I think my other observation is just the complexity on military bases, in that funding for vehicles generally flows through different channels for both the base and for the military units than the infrastructure money to put out charging equipment. And so the ownership of the vehicles, where the vehicles are fueled, those may be handled by completely different groups. And so there's a real need for a lot of coordination here at the base level, keeping these folks working together so that the growth of vehicle counts and the charging equipment, matches. And then also just looking at the mission of the base and making sure that the electrified equipment is meeting the needs of the base before you dive too deeply in. But I think sort of the crawl, walk, run, getting vehicles into your fleet, using those on a day-to-day basis and seeing how they work out, and then gradually, expanding that is a real good approach to the electrification process.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you both for a really engaging webinar. We're going to go ahead and wrap up, but before we do that, I'd like to remind you that our next webinar is in 2 weeks on Thursday, July 11th. It will be on DoD-funded research efforts to advance sustainable chemical biomanufacturing for DoD applications, while also reducing the production of toxic waste streams that may require treatment. This webinar will feature 2 speakers, Dr. David Graham from the Oak Ridge National Lab and Dr. Philip Lares Casanova from Northeastern University. As Tim mentioned, you can visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for this and other webinars through the end of 2024. And before we conclude, I'd like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it at this time if you can take just a moment to complete a very short survey that will pop up on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to our phenomenal speakers.